Hello and welcome to 168 Hours. My name is Razmik Martirosyan, and starting today, in cooperation with Global Campus of Human Rights, we're launching a new series of interviews on human rights issues. Our first episode is about AI influence on human rights, and joining us is Professor George Ulrich, Academic Director of Global Campus of Human Rights. Professor Ulrich, thank you very much for making the time.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very delighted to engage in this interview. It's a big topic, so it will be interesting to see where it leads us. Maybe just a few words about the Global Campus of Human Rights. We are an association of universities in many different regions of the world. We have postgraduate programs in human rights, interdisciplinary master's programs in 8 regions of the world, including, in fact, one that is anchored at the Yerevan State University in Armenia, Yerevan State University in Yerevan. Yeah, let's go.
Yeah, let's begin with a broad question. How do you assess the overall impact of artificial intelligence on human rights, on fundamental human rights?
So that's it's a big and complex question. I mean, I think the first distinction to be made, or the first point to be made, is that artificial intelligence obviously can have both positive and negative impacts. There's no doubt artificial intelligence is a technological development that will profoundly affect our lives in many, many different regards, and also for the better in some regards. Artificial intelligence can help to realize human rights objectives, whether it's the right to health, providing high quality health services to underprivileged and underserviced communities, to enhance the accuracy of diagnosis and treatments and so on. Similarly, with regard to right to education, and in many, many other respects, we expect that human rights can benefit from artificial intelligence. And in fact, I can just anticipate in the Global Campus of Human Rights, we're trying to really focus on this also, and we have a big project called AI for human rights. So that's to try to also accentuate the positive potentials. But that said, there's a big focus on different negative impacts and possible risks. And I think one can think about this at different levels. The first level has to do with the immediate impacts of adopting AI in different parts of our work and social administration. And many of the tools and instruments that are emerging to regulate human rights take a risk-based approach. They try to identify the risk levels of a human rights adaptation or application, an AI application, and they say that there are certain risk levels that are so high that it's off limits, that one simply should not use artificial intelligence in these ways, or at least private individuals and private enterprises cannot and should not do it. Then you have high risk applications which require a very large level of vigilance, and you have medium risk and low risk applications which also require awareness and vigilance, but to a lesser degree. And there's just so many different typologies of risks. There are discrimination risks, so biases can be built into algorithms, for example, which is something that there's been a lot of focus on and people are very aware of. AI can be used for surveillance purposes, for example. It can process and source data about us that threaten, maybe in some regards, our right to privacy. AI can be used in many other ways that can directly harm individuals. I mean, the focus that we've had recently on things like deep fakes, for example, which is an obvious violation again of right to privacy, and more generally the use of social media and AI for bullying purposes, and so on and so forth. So there are plenty of risks of different kinds.
Yeah, how would you assess the legal framework? If we talk about the international level and the regional level.
So the two main, in Europe, the two main instruments that were both adopted in 2024 are the EU AI Act and the Council of Europe has a framework convention on artificial intelligence and human rights. Both are very interesting documents. They probably in many ways supplement each other. The EU member states have all ratified the Council of Europe's framework convention, and the AI Act will be a part of the EU's compliance with and implementation of the Council of Europe's framework convention. And as I anticipated, these are risk-based approaches. So what they essentially do is they start with an assessment of the risk level you're dealing with. And if it's a high or medium risk level application, but not totally off limits, then you have to do some form of what is also called due diligence or human rights impact assessments, where you very clearly map what are the potential adverse impacts that the application can have on human rights. You have to adopt what's called a mitigation strategy. So you have to say, how can you reduce those adverse impacts and how can you continue to monitor them? And you have to carefully report on what you're doing every step along the way. And finally, a requirement in the Council of Europe's legal framework is that you have to ensure there are remedies in case things against all good intentions go wrong. So that's the basic outline and the basic framework of these European instruments. And they are, I think, quite well designed and well conceived, but it remains to be seen how effective they are in a world where corporate enterprises and many countries in different parts of the world are just charging forward, plowing forward in developing AI and scared of being left behind.
Are there specific human rights that are most at the risk due to the rise of AI technologies? You mentioned about some of them.
I mean, there are some, that are obvious. Like we said, right to privacy, non-discrimination, for example. There's this risk of biases in algorithms and in also the data on which AI tools are being trained, that might include potential biases. There's, of course, also the risk of hallucinations, where you get simply false and misleading information that then might lead applications in the totally wrong direction. As I said, issues having to do with bullying, with harassment, with deep fakes and so on. You also, you can use AI to manipulate information, and the whole concept of a common public understanding of factuality and truth, for example, is sometimes called into question, because you can provide false information that seems credible and that somehow resonates inside the echo chambers that people inhabit to source their information. Just to give a totally different example, I think another one which is very, very important is the automation of profoundly important decisions, like, for example, automated lethal weapons, and having drones or other weapons, in fact, being charged with making decisions about who shall live and who shall die, which targets are being attacked, and so on. These are scary prospects, and the idea that AI somehow requires human decision making in the final instance is a noble aspiration or idea, but whether we'll be able to maintain and implement that is an open question.
What do you think? Should there be global organizations to regulate AI, like the ones we have for climate change or arms control?
This all requires political will, on the part of member states. And Europe has taken a lead in this regard. And Europe sometimes talks about this with pride and saying we are really the first region in the world to implement effective oversight mechanisms of AI and AI developments. The flip side of this is, of course, there's a risk that Europe inhibits innovation and development within its own territory and leaves that to other regions of the world, the United States and China, maybe in particular, which are driving AI technologies forward with less concern about adverse impacts, with less concern about regulation. And I think, I think certainly some form of convention regulating AI within the United Nations framework would be desirable. I'm not so sure there's political will to do that in the capital cities of the most powerful nations of the world. And in that sense, I think it's very welcome that, for example, the Council of Europe has adopted a framework convention which applies both to the 46 member states of the Council of Europe, but also to other states that might wish to sign and ratify it. And I can I can say, for example, I happen to right now be living part of my time in Canada, even if I work with the global campus in Venice, Italy. And Canada has signed the Council of Europe's Framework Convention, even if it's outside the Council of Europe territory, you know. So it is seen as a welcome development by many countries around the world, but whether there will be really a will to adopt an effective framework for regulation of AI at a global level, um, I mean that remains to be seen, you know. But would it be desirable and welcome? I think yes, it would be welcome because it would also mean that there would be a more level playing field for the companies and the enterprises that are involved in developing these technologies. And I think that's a huge question, you know, inclusion and exclusion with regard to AI. That's another level of concern beyond the immediate risks that AI applications might entail.
What do you think, what role civil society and human rights organizations play in shaping the future of AI governance?
I think civil society plays an enormously important role in all human rights protection. I mean, we need civil society to hold governments to account for their international human rights obligations. But we need also civil society to help us understand what the issues are, you know, and very often it comes from below. People are saying these and these and these uses of AI are problematic or not acceptable, and you need civil society even in a bigger scale. You know, another issue we didn't really talk about so much yet is the way in which AI is hugely resource demanding. I mean, it's very energy intensive, and it also requires a lot of water for cooling systems and other things like this. And these are resources that could be used differently as well, and that in some ways might threaten the planet. You know, and this is again something that probably civil society will speak about more than many governments might be ready to do. You know. I can tell you that Global Campus of Human Rights works very closely with an organization called Right Livelihood, which awards also an alternative Nobel Prize related to environment sustainability and social justice. We work very closely with Right Livelihood, and one of the three main areas of our cooperation is AI and the effects and impacts of AI. Another one is children's rights and the rights of future generations. And of course, they're very closely linked because how the planet will be for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on depends a lot on technological developments. And the third dimension, by the way, is climate justice. You know, so we see them all as very deeply interlinked topics, and that is something that comes from a cooperation between academia and civil society.
You mentioned about AI benefits. However, there are a lot of fears because it's developing very, very quickly, and people are afraid of what will happen in the future. What are your predictions maybe about this issue?
Yeah, as I started out by saying, you know, there's different ways in which you can look at positive and negative impacts. And we talked about, you know, direct influence on enjoying, for example, improved healthcare or education. And these were just a few examples, so you could come up with many. There are the immediate risks. There are also sort of more deeper, more structural risks. You know, the way in which AI is very likely to amplify existing inequalities. So those who are already well positioned and privileged will likely benefit more from AI than more marginalized and underprivileged members of the human family and communities in society. So investors who have access to the best AI tools, the richer investors, will benefit more on the international equities markets than people who don't have that kind of access. You know, AI will filter who can get loans to buy houses and mortgages, and who can be insured and not be insured, and so on. There's just so many different ways in which there's a likelihood that AI will indirectly benefit some segments of society much more than others, and probably also some societies in some regions of the world much more than others. Our colleagues in different regions of the Global Campus of Human Rights express a lot of concern about this. You know, they want us to focus on the immediate misuses and tangible risks of AI, but they also want us to focus on the underlying structural issues of inequality, structural deprivation and impoverishment, and so on, and how AI is most likely going to reinforce that, you know. And then going even one step further, there's a whole sort of catastrophic vision of AI taking control of humans, you know, that kind of thing, which I have to say is very hard to know if that's a real founded fear, or is it a kind of apocalyptic vision. I think the jury is out. You know, we don't know, but all the more reason why effective monitoring and oversight mechanisms are essential. Yeah, so we talked about both immediate risks of the use of AI, and there's a broad menu of them, and then we talked about how AI is likely to impact the more underlying structural patterns of privilege and disadvantage, inequalities, and so on. And I think a third level that is very interesting to me as someone who's coming to human rights also from the perspective of social science and philosophy is the way in which AI kind of calls into question some of our underlying presumptions of authorship, for example. Who is, I mean, you have an artwork generated by AI. Is the person who put in the prompt the author of the artwork, or who is the artwork, the author? You know, these kind of very fundamental issues. Agency, you know, does AI manipulate our behavior in ways where we start to question whether we are really responsible for our own decisions, or are we agents of the actions that we are enabling and facilitating, you know? I mean, the kind of ways in which we see that voting behavior, for example, and many other forms of behavior are very susceptible to manipulation through artificial intelligence and related tools, calls into question some of our underlying presumptions of right and wrong, of ethics, and of what it means to be human. The way in which people and teenagers, maybe in particular, start to develop their sense of self in a dialogue with a machine. You know, these are scary prospects and developments that we're only starting to see the beginning of, I think.
Should there be any subjects on AI literacy in the schools?
You know, to be honest, I mean, we are in the global campus, and this is something I can talk about in a minute. You know, we're developing now an AI policy, as probably many organizations are, and I can say a few words about that in a moment. But just to anticipate, you know, one of the issues that we're very aware of in this connection is that aside from regulations and guidelines on the use of AI, we really need to invest in AI literacy. You know, we have to educate ourselves about AI in many different ways, both how to make use of it in a constructive and positive and responsible way, but also to simply understand its potentials, its impacts, and so on. And I think aside from the immediate regulation of the use of AI, there's simply a question of also political advocacy. You know, how do you see AI? I mean, AI is entangled both with environmental concerns, but it's also very entangled with corporate interests, you know, and how do we as a human rights organization view that, the corporate the corporate interest dimension of AI, and the competitive field that we see there. And then finally, also the way in which it affects the information space, you know. So there are big ticket issues in addition to the immediate implications. And we need to educate ourselves, you know. So I can say school children, yes, should certainly have some form of education about AI if the teachers are competent to provide that. And I'm not always sure that's the case. You know, sometimes the young probably know and understand these things better. But we at university level absolutely also need to be educated and to educate ourselves. I think that's a hugely important.
But how's the situation in this regard, despite the global campus of human rights? Because you are a professor in different schools, as I know, in different universities.
Oh, so this is certainly a topic that we talk about. We have master's programs, as I mentioned, in 8 regions of the world. You know, so we have in Europe, we have in Southeast Europe, the Balkan region, we have in the Caucasus region with the headquarters in Yerevan, we have in Central Asia, we have in the Middle East, the Arab world, based in Beirut. We have in Africa with a center in Pretoria. We have in Asia Pacific with a center in Bangkok, and in Latin America with a center in Buenos Aires. So we have programs all over the world, and we come together, exchanging ideas, knowledge, information, giving mutual inspiration to each other. And one of the topics that is very regularly on our joint agendas is exactly how we view AI and how we regulate AI. And and I can say that there are people within our network who are really informed, expert in this, but most of us feel quite humble, that we feel this is a hugely important development that we only partially understand, and we really want to be open and listen and learn. Yeah. And as I said, we're developing now our own AI policy for global campus headquarters. So what we find with the AI policy is the sort of three main focus areas. We try to establish some basic rules. So if you use AI, for example, you have to be transparent about it. So you have to declare that usage, and it has to be visible and known. And that's both internally. So we have to let our colleagues know if we've used AI for a draft article or whatever it might be. But we also have to make that visible to the public if and when these kind of things are published. So that's one, and the whole issue of human oversight and human decision making. So we have to take responsibilities for outcomes of AI in the final instance. We can't say that we didn't. It's not our fault. It's the machine's fault. That doesn't. It's not acceptable. And we've tried to define some areas where we feel AI usage is becoming some commonplace and standard. It requires less deliberation and oversight. Then there are areas that are sort of breaking new ground. It requires a lot of careful analysis and investigation and so on. And then some areas that are off limits. We, for example, don't think AI should be used to make decisions with regard to human resources management. We feel that is something that should be done by humans and not by machines, and so on. So that's one level, is to establish basic rules for how we use AI. A second level is we also articulate certain general principles that we encourage ourselves and each other to reflect on. So when we use AI, we talk about ethical principles, we talk about no harm principles, we talk about integrity and agency and so on. We also talk, for example, about encouraging ourselves to reflect on the proportionality between the potentially beneficial outcomes and the resource requirements of AI. For example, saying we shouldn't automatically use AI for everything, because we also are aware that it has environmental impacts, and this is something we should reflect on. So these are sort of more abstract general principles that we encourage ourselves to take into account. And finally, we're trying to establish a procedural mechanism whereby we say these are the steps that are to be taken when a decision about using AI is adopted. These are the oversight procedures that are required, and reporting and so on. And these are the potential remediation procedures if somebody feels something is done in a wrong way or has gone wrong. So we're working on this, and we're getting fairly close to having our internal policy, and I'm sure it'll be not so different from policies in many other organizations and institutions.
Yeah, however, there are a lot of claims that, as I mentioned, AI is developing too fast, and we don't know much about it. I think it refers to black box. So how should we deal with this? How should we live in this world when something is developing and there are a lot of threats and there are a lot of fears, like it will control the world, it will control, even it will be used in the military operation, and it is in use. So how to live with this fear inside, and what should international organizations do in this way? Of course, we talked about different legal acts, etc., but the fear is there.
The fear is there, and the fear is probably justified, and I don't think that we necessarily advance our cause by just being overwhelmed by the sort of prospects of AI taking over our worlds and our lives. I think we need to mobilize ourselves, and I think the first step, as I was trying to say before, we have to stay informed, and for older generation people like myself, I mean, I'm not inclined, I don't like social media, I don't want to use social media, and I'm not inclined to learn really how to write advanced AI prompts. I feel I've developed my patterns and my habits of work totally without these tools and instruments, and I don't particularly want to engage with them, but I need to do it because I have children and I have to know what is the world that they're inhabiting, and this is a reality that requires a lot of attention, and I think it's very important that we try. We've organized in the Global Campus of Human Rights a MOOC that's called Human Rights-Based Approaches to AI. Does that MOOC have all of the definitive answers on what's right and wrong with regard to AI? No, but it's really trying to map, to chart a field that is hugely important, and this is one step along the way. Whether it's just catching up or whether it's also leading the direction for future developments, it's hard to say. But I think it's very important that we stay vigilant, and we will see topics of this nature will increasingly become part and parcel of all the different research and conferences and seminars we do in the area of human rights, and AI dimension will come in. I can give you an example more. We have colleagues who are working very much on children's rights in general, and we had the Global Campus of Human Rights, and our Secretary General, Professor Manfred Novak, was the appointed international expert on children deprived of liberty. So as children who are in prison or in institutional confinement or migration detention or conflict detention and so on, other areas of deprivation of liberty for children. There's a big focus on children's access to justice. And there's a conference in Madrid that's happening next week on this, a World Congress with children, not just about children, but involving the voices of children as well, focusing very much on access to justice. And our representation, some of our colleagues in the Global Campus of Human Rights are part of organizing a panel on the impact of AI on children's access to justice. So how AI will affect and impact this hugely important area. And I think I applaud my colleagues for taking a lead in this regard.
Finally, looking to the future, what would a human rights-based approach to AI developments look like in practical terms?
I think it's an approach that, first of all, I think the issue of some form of effective risk analysis, I think, is part and parcel of this, and so I think this is the framework. This is the framework that is established by the EU's AI Act and the Council of Europe's Framework Convention on AI and human rights. It's also deeper, the basic United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. So the way in which non-state actors, private enterprises, powerful private enterprises, are also responsible to some degree for advancing and upholding international human rights standards. And part of this is to do what we call impact assessments, risk assessments, due diligence. And I think that's very important that we find mechanisms and we find ways to really do this, to analyze carefully in advance of an AI application. What are the potential impacts for better and for worse? How can we maximize the potential objectives, the potential positive impacts, and how can we contain and minimize the risks? And then you need really very clear transparency requirements, reporting requirements, and so on, and a willingness to adapt practices. So if you identify certain risks, you have to then also change your plan so that those risks are being contained and taken into account. And I think at a deeper level, as I was anticipating before, we have to be very worried and concerned about the way in which societies are becoming increasingly unequal, and the way in which certain segments of society are being marginalized. I think so. What we see, the rise of protest politics, the rise of extremist movements on the right wing, but to some degree also on the left, is very much a reflection of people feeling neglected, marginalized, and disempowered, And I think it's very important that we're concerned about this in general, and also with regard to new technological developments, because the new technological developments are tools of both disempowerment and empowerment, and the way in which people feel cheated, marginalized, disempowered, that polarizes societies, and that's not a good development, and it's something we're seeing in the world right now. So all the more reason why we have to somehow seize these technologies as tools for inclusion, for social justice. Not easy, but
Somehow, but
important.
how?
Yeah, well, listen, I don't have a magic bullet. Nobody has a magic bullet, right? But as we were saying, I think all the different levels, I mean, these conventions, these are interstate conventions, and it's very important to get states on board. And I'm happy to see that states are signing the Council of Europe's Framework Convention. That's one thing. The next step will be ratification and putting the mechanisms into place. It's very important to get civil society mobilized, and I think civil society is mobilizing itself. Um, and academia, we have to do our part, and this is what we try to do in the Global Campus of Human Rights through our master's programs in general, and certainly through the increasing attention that we're paying to this area, which if you had asked me 5 years ago, I would have looked at you with a blank stare and I would have said, I'm not quite sure what you're talking about, and now it's one of the most challenging and important topics on our agendas.
And maybe in 5 years we'll talk about general AI, which is a theory now.
Again, these are areas where we simply have to inform ourselves, to stay vigilant, to stay informed. I mean, this whole sort of what we call AI literacy, it's just so important to foster that inside our institutions and in society in general. We need journalists as well, to keep us informed and to keep us critically questioning what's going on.
Thank you so much for an interesting interview.
Thank you too. Thank you for inviting me. And yeah, I'm happy to share my thoughts, and I don't in any way claim to have definitive answers, but I certainly feel this is an important topic.
Thank you so much for watching this interview. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.